some of you might have seen at the lunch bar today. Lindsay, if you could just say what you do and introduce yourself.
Thank you. Well, I travel around Europe speaking at events like this, and I've been doing that for about 30 years now, so I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. And same question, what is your favourite pudding? And did you get any tonight?
I did get some banoffee pie actually before.
Alright. Lindsay's just going to give a 10-minute talk.
10 to 15 minutes, yeah. Just if I can introduce you to this, it should be on each table. And in case you haven't read it yet, this is the theme for the week of the meetings organised by the Christian Union. Life, more than this. And Andy's been touching on the question, is there something more? In a number of the songs that he's been singing this evening. One of them talked about questioning your direction. Another talked about the homecoming, and then another asked the question, is there anything more? I suppose all of us would like to organise our lives so that we feel we can experience the greatest happiness or contentment or fulfilment. And a lot of students, frankly, I talk with in British universities say, well, I'm pretty happy as I am, thank you, don't disturb me. But for everyone who says that they are happy, there are a lot who are, if not searching, I would say probably restless. And that's a reflection of many of the voices that you hear in society. Let me just give you a few quotations of people I read about recently who have talked about a restlessness in life. Bob Geldof, for example, after the Live Aid concert a few years ago when he was raising money for poor children in Africa, when it was all over, he put all this immense effort into it all. He said, is that all there is? Is there nothing more than that? Is that what life's about? There was this sense of what the French called ennui, or the Germans call it Sehnsucht, the sense of longing, that maybe there's something beyond what I've been engaged in. Michael Schumacher, who's sadly in a coma at the moment because of a skiing accident, who was, of course, world motor racing champion about 6 times. Most people, aficionados, think he was one of the 3 greatest motor race drivers of all time, probably with Juan Manuel Fangio, and also maybe the Brazilian driver a few years ago who was killed in a car accident, Ayrton Senna. Before his accident, he said this, it was wonderful to be world champion 5 times, but I can't help thinking there must be something more. And then, in the Financial Times, I don't read it normally, but I was on a plane one day, it was the only English-speaking newspaper, so I got a copy of it, and I was shocked when I opened the centre page. There was a box with a quotation in it by somebody working in the city, an investment banker, and he just said this, all my life for 30 years, I've been climbing the corporate ladder, and when I got to the top, I found I'd climbed up the wrong wall. I thought it was an honest but disturbing statement. Or this quotation from Bernard Levin. You may or may not have read him. He was a Times columnist, an atheistic Jew who died of cancer a few years ago. And just before he died, right towards the end of his life, he wrote an editorial, again in the centre page in the Times, and he wrote this, as an atheist, countries like ours are full of people who have all the material comforts they desire, together with such non-material blessings as a happy family, and yet lead lives of quiet and at times noisy desperation, understanding nothing but the fact that there's a hole inside them, and that however much food and drink they pour into it, however many motor cars and television sets they stuff it with, however many well-balanced children and loyal friends they parade around, it aches. Now, you might feel that's a rather pessimistic, but let me just give you one last quotation in this respect. You probably never read graffiti on toilet walls, I'm afraid I do. Fallen Welsh background. And I was in the men's toilet in the Radcliffe Camera in Oxford the other day, which is where people study history. And I was in the men's loo, and on the wall there I noticed 4 different people had written something in the cubicle with no one else to observe. Somebody had written, I spend 8 hours working every day to get money to enjoy life. Couldn't have been a history undergraduate, which is what I was, because we never worked 8 hours. Anyway, 8 hours working every day to get money to enjoy life. Somebody else had written underneath that in a different handwriting, and I spend 8 hours sleeping every day to get enough rest to enjoy life. And a third person had written underneath that, and I spend 2 hours each day eating so I can get energy to enjoy life. And a fourth person had written underneath that, and I spend 6 hours each day escaping from life. Well, I wonder if you experience anything like that. Some people do in their most honest moments. Whether we do or we don't, very few people will go to the church for an answer because they think it's out of touch, it's boring, it's irrelevant, it's too complicated, it's already tried, they're hypocrites, and so on. Why bother to go there? So it comes as a mega shock to such people to read the words which are on the t-shirts or the hoodies of lots of people here dressed in blue. One of them could stand up. Can you just stand up there? On the front it says, life more than this, and on the back it says, a quotation from Jesus, I've come that they may have life and have it in all its fullness or abundance. What a shocking statement from Jesus. Because the last word, if I asked 100 people in Bristol University, what's the kind of word that is conjured up in your thinking when you think about the Christian faith? I bet no more than 1 or 2 out of 100 would say either joy or life in its fullness. But that's what Jesus is saying here. Well, what does he mean briefly? What did Jesus mean when he said, I've come to give you life in all its fullness? I would suggest to enjoy a full life, you need to have 5 or 6 things. And through the week, we're going to try to unpack and look at those 5 or 6 dimensions in the lunchtime talks that we have listed in the overview you've got there, and in the evenings. The first thing, and the 6 are these: a value system, freedom within a framework, forgiveness, unconditional love, hope, being in a community, those key things. And as I go through them very briefly, I'd like you to ask yourself, if you could, can I find any or all of these in my worldview? How I construct my life and how I look at the world, and ask yourself honestly whether your worldview answers these 5 or 6 dimensions to gaining life in all its fullness, and compare with, as we go through the week, perhaps as you come back, the answer that the New Testament gives about the person of Christ. So very briefly, firstly, the first building block, if you like, it's okay, the first building block to life in all its fullness is having a value system. Don't look to the university to get it, because you won't get it from the university. I talked to one student in Sheffield University the other day, and she said, university has disappointed me profoundly. She was studying English literature. She said, it gave me spokes, but no hub. It didn't give me a framework for life. And some people say that universities in the past were founded, as it were, rather like a telescope, to give us a big view on the big questions in life. But these days it's all atomized, and it's more like a microscope, where you study a very small part of a major discipline. It's like my mother-in-law said to my wife, did he really study history in Oxford? Because he only seems to know a little bit about what happened for 200 years between 16 and 1800. He's very ignorant. And many of us are like that when we go to university. Our understanding is limited. It's not telescopic, it's microscopic. Even in philosophy departments, often they argue in semantics, the meaning of words, rather than the big questions and the big issues in life. And really, one of the options you've got is to make up your own, a kind of pick and mix value system. But the contention of Christians is that the teaching of Jesus provides the best framework there is for guidelines for how we live our lives. As one friend of mine, even a communist, said to me, I think Jesus' teaching is the acropolis of teaching in the Western world. However, as we'll hear tomorrow night, can't really separate his moral teaching from his egocentric or self-centered teaching. So I think the first thing is a sense of values, a framework for life, and related to that is freedom within a framework. Astonishingly, many people think that the Christian faith really is going to spoil their fun and restrict their freedoms. Whereas actually, when you listen to the words of Jesus, he said, the Son of Man, referring to himself, when you know him, he will set you free free to be what you were meant to be, to enter into a relationship with God as our Father, freedom from fear, freedom from failure, freedom from self-centeredness, freedom to become a child of the living God. So Jesus talks about freedom as a second dimension, if you like, to life in all its fullness. We'll try to unpack that much more on Thursday night in much more detail. The third thing, I think, is a sense of significance. We all need to have this, and Andy touched on this in some of his music, a sense of significance and meaning. Now, many people say to me, I get my significance and meaning from my friends and my family, my sport or whatever it is. The interesting thing is, if you look at 4 areas in the humanities, the great thinkers in these 4 areas in the 20th century, they all try to portray what the world is like and existence is like if there's no God. That's the artists, the philosophers, the filmmakers, and the writers. You look at some of the great writers and artists like Fellini, the filmmaker, or Francis Bacon, and I'll trace this on Thursday night, but I'll just give you one quotation. When I was a student in Paris in the 1980s, there were a couple of existentialist philosophers at the time. It was the dominant worldview. Don't hear much about it these days. Postmodernity really has developed off the back of existentialism. But the great thinker was a guy called Jean-Paul Sartre. And he said that he denied the existence of God, and he said, man is absurd if there's no God, but he must act as if he's not. In other words, the key thing is to demonstrate your existence, to authenticate your existence by making choices. Doesn't matter whether they're apparently right or wrong, you just make the choices. But he talked about man being absurd if there was no God. Of course, we don't live like that. But he said that's the state of man if there's no God who is there. Do you know what I saw? Students coming out of Sartre's lectures in the centre of the city, jumping off the bridges and committing suicide in the river. Because they saw the logical implications of his worldview, that if man is absurd and there's no God who is there, what's the point in human existence? He pushed it to its logical conclusion, and some of his students did and lost their lives as a consequence. Now, Christians argue, of course, that our significance comes from knowing that we are not alone in the universe, but there's a God who is there, who has come down, shown us what he's like, and revealed himself in the person of Christ, and demonstrating, therefore, that we are not alone in the universe, but there's someone who has created us, with whom we can be reconciled in relationship. So that's the third thing. Significance, as well as freedom, and values. Ask yourself if you find these 3 in your own worldview. 4 and 5. Forgiveness, and also unconditional love. And both these things are found in the cross of Jesus Christ. As Andy said, many people don't like to talk too much about forgiveness these days, but we long to be in a culture where justice is demonstrated. You can even see it on the news in the last few days with the trial of this guy in the IRA who got off. People just feel that the law is an ass, that justice hasn't been seen to be done. We want to live in a moral universe, and people say, if there's a God, I want him to judge those who've really done wrong. The problem is you can't then say logically, I want God to judge other people for their wrongdoing, but I don't want him to judge me. We are all guilty, and one of the things that is striking as I get older certainly is the wonder of a clean conscience. It's a great thing. It's only possible not because we are perfect or essentially innately good, but because we can experience forgiveness through Christ's substitutionary death on the cross. Now again, humanists and others have seen this, and they argue that if there is no God, where can you find forgiveness? Even Mark Twain, the author of Huckleberry Finn, said, Western man is the only man who blushes and deserves to. But perhaps even more strikingly was an interview I heard once with a very famous female humanist called Margarita Lasky, who died a few years ago, and I was really struck by her interview on Radio 4. I was struck by her searing honesty. She said this, what amazes me about you Christians is your forgiveness. Because I do not believe there's a God who is there, I have no one to forgive me, and I carry my sins around with me all the time. A devastating statement near the end of her life. Now many people say, well, essentially I feel like I'm a pretty good person. God should judge some of those other people who have done wrong. Well, in the New Testament, God says he'll be very fair. He's speaking through the Apostle Paul. He says, I'll give you a lower level of judgment. I'll judge you by the standards by which you judge other people. Isn't that fair? Even if we're not Christians. But imagine this is what happens therefore. Supposing there's a cassette tape in our chest, and we live for, say, 70 years. And every time we make a moral judgment on somebody else, that moral judgment we make on somebody else, he's a liar, he's a fool, she's a backbiter, she's shallow or whatever. Every moral judgment we make on other people, it's recorded in the cassette tape. Okay, the judgments we make of other people. And if there's a day of judgment, which Jesus spoke about more than anybody else, on the day of judgment the tape is played back. God says, I'll judge you by your own standards. Still fall short. Is there any way out? The Bible says there is. Through the cross of Jesus Christ, because God says that's where I'll meet you, nowhere else. He's taken the judgment you deserve so that you might be set free. And that's the mark of God's searing, unconditional love towards us. We crave, all of us, unconditional love. The famous psychologist Rogers said it's one of the two essential things that everybody needs to be loved unconditionally. And we get tired of politicians who promise things and don't deliver. Or even in relationships, people who promise and don't deliver. The newspapers are full just over the last 2 or 3 days. It's very sad to see that Susanna Reid, who's that attractive presenter on breakfast television, who came third in Strictly Come Dancing just a few months ago. And when they were having the final vote, said, I'm so pleased that it wasn't her husband, she's been living with him for about 20 years, but my partner, she said, he's so long-suffering and he's considerate, he's just a wonderful man. And all the time he was advertising himself in a Lonely Hearts Club thing in the newspapers, saying he was a single man, looking for a woman with whom he could have a lifelong relationship between 35 and 45. Now they've separated. Devastating. Remember the Beatles, long ago, singing one of their hallmark songs, All You Need Is Love, and then they split up just a few weeks later after they recorded the song. We long for love which is unconditional and which sticks. And the New Testament teaches that God commends his love, his unconditional love towards us, in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. So unconditional love. Then the last thing, the last dimension to life in all its fullness or abundance is hope. German theologians don't often say much that's very helpful, but there was one of them called Emil Brunner. He said, just as oxygen is essential for the lungs to function and for us to breathe, so hope is to mankind. You have to ask, where do we find hope in the world today? Not only beyond death, but in this life also. The answer that comes to us in the Bible is through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because we believe he rose from the dead, and we look at the evidence for that Friday lunchtime, and because we believe he's alive today and promises to accompany us through the whole of life, Christians speak of having a hope. That's why when I was in India some years ago, I said to one woman living in the north of the country, how is it that you're a Christian in a country where most people are Muslims and Hindus? She said 3 reasons. The first is it's only through Jesus Christ I can have a relationship with God as Father. The second is only through Jesus Christ I can experience my sins forgiven and have a clean conscience. And the third is only through Jesus Christ I can have hope of eternal life and hope in this life also. So let me return to the question I asked at the beginning for you to reflect on after this evening is over. Life in all its fullness, if that is made up through these 5 or 6 dimensions, a value system, freedom within a framework, unconditional love, forgiveness, hope. To what extent can you find these in your world, in your worldview? Wouldn't it be interesting to reflect this week on the claims of the Christians who say they are all uniquely found in one person, Jesus Christ. Freedom in a framework, a value system comes from his teaching, a sense of significance comes from his deity, sense of forgiveness and unconditional love comes from his cross, and a sense of hope comes from his resurrection. That's the contention of Christians, and we'd like to lay that before you this week and invite you to come and reflect with us on the biblical or the New Testament answer to those questions. Well, tomorrow we'll be continuing on this theme by looking at the question of the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. In what sense was he unique? And we'll be looking at his claims to deity tomorrow evening. We also believe that the Bible gives the most satisfying answers to the big questions in life, like the issue of suffering, which we'll be looking at on Wednesday. So we invite you to come along to those. And especially I'd encourage you to come on Friday, when we'll be looking at the evidence for the resurrection, by which the Christian faith stands or falls. But in the meantime, I hope that you just take a few things away with you this evening. Please take one of these, which gives you information about all the lunchtime talks and the evening, so you can decide which things you want to come along to during the course of the week. And then we'd really appreciate it, perhaps, if you could fill in one of these feedback forms, because we want to see how we can improve on this evening. I think this is the first time the Christian Union has done an evening like this, and we'd like to find out how we could improve. But also, if you are touched by some of the music you've heard or the presentation, and you want to reflect and discuss with some friends a little more about the truth claims of the Christian message and Jesus' claims to give us life in all its fullness, we'll be having some discussion groups looking at this theme in the coming weeks. And if you're interested in coming along to them, please just tick the box which says, "Tell me more." And we'll be looking at a series called Christianity Explored in the next few weeks. There may be one or two people who've got to that stage where you say, "Yeah, I can't find better answers in my worldview or anywhere else. Please count me in. I think Jesus is the real deal. And I'm even ready now to commit my life to following him." Well, if you reach that stage, I'd encourage you to tick that box, count me in, and perhaps come and pick up one of these free booklets, which my friend Michael has written, who's speaking each lunchtime, just entitled Yes. It's so simple that even somebody who doesn't read books like myself can read through it before you go to sleep at night, so please come and ask for one if you want one. Well, thank you very much for coming along. I think there's still drinks and some desserts afterwards, but before we close, Andy's going to sing a concluding song for us.